It was a random Saturday morning, and I had no plans. The week had been draining, work deadlines, traffic jams, and an overall sense of being stuck in a rut. I had envisioned spending the weekend catching up on sleep and maybe watching a few movies. But then I saw the flyer. It was taped to the window of the cafe I'd stopped by for breakfast. Join us for Community Cleanup Day. Make a difference in your neighborhood. Normally, I'd glance at something like that and keep walking. But for some reason, maybe guilt, maybe boredom, I took a closer look. The event was scheduled to start in an hour at the park just a few blocks from my apartment. I told myself it was a good excuse to get outside and do something productive. So, after finishing my coffee, I headed home, threw on some old clothes, and walked over to the park. When I arrived, a small group of volunteers had already gathered. There were about 20 of us, families, a few retirees, and some people who looked like me, young professionals who didn't quite know what they were doing there. A woman named Karen, the organizer, handed out gloves, garbage bags, and t-shirts with the event's logo. She gave a quick pep talk about how small efforts like ours could make a big difference. I ended up paired with a guy named Marcus. He looked to be in his early 30s, with a friendly smile and a natural ease about him. We were assigned to clean up a stretch of the creek that ran through the park. At first, it was exactly what you'd expect, picking up plastic bottles, candy wrappers, and the occasional piece of clothing. Marcus and I made small talk, mostly about work and how we ended up at the event. I wasn't planning on coming, Marcus admitted. My sister guilt-tripped me into it. She's a huge community service person. I laughed. I just saw the flyer this morning. Figured I'd give it a shot. We worked quietly for a while after that, the only sounds being the rustle of the trash bags and the babble of the creek. But then we found something that changed the entire day. About half an hour into our cleanup, Marcus called out, "Hey, check this out." He was pointing to a large, waterlogged backpack half buried in the mud near the creek's edge. Curious, I walked over. "Think there's anything in it?" "Only one way to find out," Marcus said, pulling it free and unzipping it carefully. Inside, we found what looked like someone's entire life, clothes, a few toiletries, and a worn-out journal. The journal was soaked, but the writing was still legible. It belonged to someone named Eric, who appeared to have been homeless. The entries were heartbreaking. Eric wrote about his struggles finding shelter, dealing with loneliness, and trying to hold on to hope despite everything. One passage stood out: "Sometimes I feel invisible, like no one sees me or cares if I'm even here. But I try to remind myself that the world is full of good people, even if I don't see them every day." Marcus and I exchanged a glance. "This is heavy," he said. "Yeah," I agreed. "What do we do with it?" Karen suggested we take the backpack to a local shelter that worked with unhoused individuals. So, after finishing our cleanup duties, Marcus and I drove over together. The woman at the shelter, Teresa, was kind and understanding. She recognized the name Eric right away. "He used to stay here on and off," she said. "But we haven't seen him in a few months. I hope he's okay." She promised to hold onto the backpack in case Eric returned. By the time I got home, I felt drained but also strangely energized. The day had been nothing like I'd expected. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about Eric and the journal. It made me realize how easy it is to overlook people who are struggling. I started volunteering at the shelter once a month, helping out with meals and donation drives. Marcus and I stayed in touch, too. We even organized another cleanup event a few months later, this time with a bigger turnout. The most surprising part came almost a year later. I was volunteering at the shelter when Teresa called me over. "Guess who showed up today?" she said, smiling. It was Eric. He looked healthier than I'd imagined, with a spark of determination in his eyes. When I introduced myself and told him about finding his backpack, he was overwhelmed. "I thought it was gone forever," he said. "That journal, it's the only thing that kept me going some days." Eric's story had a happy ending. He'd recently secured stable housing and was working part-time at a local grocery store. Meeting him was a reminder of how small actions, a few hours of picking up trash, turning in a backpack, could ripple out in ways I'd never expected. Now, every time I see a community event flyer, I stop and take a second look. You never know what kind of journey it might lead to. Second story. It all started with a phone call at 11 p.m. "Hey, you up?" My best friend Ben's voice crackled through the speaker. I groaned. Not really, but now I am. "What's up?" "Pack a bag. We're going on a road trip." Ben wasn't exactly known for his sense of timing or practicality, but he was the kind of guy who could talk you into anything. I hesitated for about 30 seconds before pulling myself out of bed, grabbing a backpack, and heading out. By midnight, we were on the highway, blasting music and laughing about nothing in particular. The plan, or lack thereof, was to drive aimlessly, maybe stop for pancakes somewhere, and just escape the monotony of our small town for a few hours. What we didn't know was that the trip would turn into something much bigger than either of us anticipated. Around 2 a.m., we pulled into a gas station in the middle of nowhere. While Ben filled up the tank, I wandered inside to grab snacks. That's when I saw it, a bulletin board near the entrance, cluttered with missing person flyers, community notices, and advertisements for local events. One flyer caught my eye. It was an old, faded picture of a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, with a striking resemblance to my mother. The name at the bottom read Margaret Sinclair. My mom's name was Margaret, but I'd always known her as Margaret Hayes. Sinclair was her maiden name, one she never talked about. I stared at the flyer, my heart racing. The details were sparse. She'd been reported missing in 1985, last seen in a town about 30 miles from where we were standing. The kicker? She'd been reported missing a full year before she married my dad. I grabbed the flyer and brought it out to Ben, who took one look at it and said, "This is insane." "Are you sure that's your mom?" "I'm not sure of anything right now," I admitted. Instead of turning back, we decided to head to the town listed on the flyer. I couldn't explain it, but I felt compelled to dig deeper. The town, Riverside, was tiny, one main street, a handful of stores, and an eerie stillness that hung in the air even as the sun began to rise. We found a diner that was just opening and decided to grab breakfast while I tried to process everything. The waitress, an older woman named Joanne, noticed the flyer in my hand. "Where'd you find that?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "At a gas station," I said. "Do you know anything about it?" Joanne hesitated, then nodded. "Margaret Sinclair, yeah, I remember her. She was a sweet girl. Worked here for a while. Then one day, she just vanished." "Vanished?" I echoed, feeling a lump form in my throat. Joanne leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Some folks said she ran off with a boyfriend. Others thought something bad happened to her. There were rumors, but no one ever found out for sure." I couldn't shake the feeling that my mom's past was far more complicated than I'd ever realized. As we left the diner, Ben suggested we check out the local library to see if there were any old newspaper articles about her disappearance. It sounded like a long shot, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. The library was small and smelled like dust, but the librarian was helpful. She led us to a microfilm machine and showed us how to navigate the archives. After an hour of searching, we found an article from 1985. The headline read, "Local woman missing under suspicious circumstances." The article detailed how Margaret Sinclair had been dating a man named Robert at the time of her disappearance. According to witnesses, they'd had a heated argument the night before she was last seen. Robert had been questioned by the police but was never charged. The case went cold after that. I felt a wave of nausea. None of this fit with the image of my mom as the warm, loving woman who'd raised me. Who was Robert? And why had she never mentioned any of this? By the time we left the library, I was overwhelmed with questions. "Do you want to keep digging?" Ben asked gently. I nodded. "I have to." We decided to track down Robert. With some help from Joanne at the diner, we learned he still lived in the area. His house was a rundown property on the outskirts of town. When we knocked on the door, a man in his late 60s answered. His face was lined with age, and his expression hardened when I mentioned Margaret. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, starting to close the door. "Wait," I pleaded. "She's my mom. I just want answers." That stopped him in his tracks. Robert invited us inside, though it was clear he was uneasy. He told us he and my mom had been in love but had a volatile relationship. The night before she disappeared, they'd fought about her wanting to leave town for a fresh start. She said she couldn't stay here anymore, Robert said, his voice heavy with regret. I never saw her again after that. When I asked if he thought she might still be alive, he hesitated. "I always hoped so. But I don't know." We left Riverside with more questions than answers, but the trip had given me a new perspective on my mom's life. When I confronted her about it a few days later, she was quiet for a long time before finally opening up. She admitted that she'd left Riverside to escape a toxic relationship and start over. She hadn't meant to disappear, but had felt it was the only way to move forward. That road trip changed everything for me. It taught me that people are more complex than we realize, and even the ones we think we know best have hidden chapters in their stories. Ben still jokes about how our random adventure turned into a full-blown investigation. But for me, it was so much more than that. It was a journey into the unknown, and a chance to reconnect with my mom in a way I never thought possible. Third story. About a year ago, I hit rock bottom. I'd been living in New York City for 5 years, working as a graphic designer, and it felt like the life I had dreamed of was slowly suffocating me. The constant noise, the pressure to climb the corporate ladder, and the overwhelming loneliness of being surrounded by millions of strangers, it all caught up to me. So, one day, I quit. I didn't have much of a plan, but I knew I needed to get away from the city. While scrolling through job boards, I came across a listing for a property caretaker in a remote mountain town called Blackwood. The job involved maintaining a small cabin resort during the off-season. It sounded like exactly what I needed: solitude, fresh air, and a chance to reset. I packed my things and drove upstate, leaving the chaos of the city behind. Blackwood was tiny, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. The resort I was hired to manage was perched on the edge of a dense forest, with 5 cabins spread out along a gravel path. During the summer, it was a hotspot for hikers and nature lovers, but in the fall and winter, it was practically deserted. The main cabin was cozy but dated, with creaky floors and a wood-burning stove. My boss, Margaret, was a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s who gave me a brief rundown of my duties before leaving me to it. "Watch out for the locals," she said with a wry smile before driving off. "They like to talk." At first, the isolation was a welcome change. I spent my days chopping firewood, repairing fences, and hiking through the surrounding woods. The quiet was almost therapeutic, and I started to feel like I was finally catching my breath. But as the weeks went on, I began to notice something strange about the town. The locals were friendly enough, but there was a sense of guardedness whenever I asked about Blackwood's history. They'd smile politely and change the subject or give vague, rehearsed answers. One afternoon, I stopped by the town's tiny library to check out a book. While browsing the shelves, I found a section of old newspapers and magazines. Curious, I started flipping through them, looking for any mention of the town's past. That's when I stumbled across an article from 1978. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearance of Blackwood Family Remains Unsolved." The article detailed how the Wilcox family, parents and 2 young children, had vanished from their cabin in the middle of the night. There were no signs of a struggle, and their belongings were left behind as if they'd simply walked out the door. The case had baffled local authorities and remained unsolved to this day. What struck me most was the location. The Wilcox family had been staying at Cabin 3, one of the cabins in the resort I was now managing. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the article. The cabin had been empty since I arrived, but the next morning, I decided to check it out. Inside, it looked just like the other cabins, rustic furniture, a small kitchenette, and a single bedroom with 2 bunk beds. But there was something off about the atmosphere, a heaviness that made the air feel colder. In the closet, I found a faded notebook tucked behind a pile of old blankets. It looked like a child's journal, with doodles and shaky handwriting on the pages. The entries were innocent at first, descriptions of the forest, drawings of birds and squirrels, but the last entry gave me chills. It read, "Mommy and Daddy are arguing again. I heard someone outside last night. They said we have to leave soon, but I don't want to go. The man in the woods scares me." I showed the journal to Ben, the owner of the town's general store, hoping he could shed some light on the Wilcox family. He went pale when he saw it. "Where did you find this?" "Cabin 3, I said. Ben hesitated before lowering his voice. "People around here don't talk about the Wilcoxes. It's bad luck to bring it up. But if you're smart, you'll leave that cabin alone." His warning only made me more determined to uncover the truth. Over the next few days, I dug through more old newspapers, piecing together what little information I could find. The Wilcox case wasn't the only strange occurrence in Blackwood's history. Over the years, there had been numerous reports of people hearing voices in the woods, seeing shadowy figures, or experiencing unexplainable events near the cabins. One night, I decided to stay in cabin 3. I brought a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a notebook to document anything unusual. At first, everything was quiet. But around midnight, I started hearing faint whispers, like distant voices carried by the wind. I stepped outside, shining my flashlight into the trees. The forest was still, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Suddenly, I heard a loud crack, like a branch snapping, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. I ran back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I found footprints outside the cabin, leading into the forest. They didn't look like animal tracks, they were too large and too human. I reported the incident to Margaret, who listened carefully before saying, "Blackwood has its secrets. Some things are better left alone." I stayed in Blackwood for 6 more months, but the experience in cabin 3 stayed with me. To this day, I don't know what really happened to the Wilcox family or why the town is so reluctant to talk about its past. But my time there taught me that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and that sometimes, the truth is more unsettling than any fiction.